the fall of Bashar al-Assad and the regional reverberations. Syria's neighbors, countries that had a stake in the civil war, are figuring out what comes next. Israel's unprecedented attack on journalism in Gaza claims 4 more Palestinian lives. And Starlink, another brainchild from the mind of Elon Musk and the potential dangers that lie therein. It's been 2 weeks now since the fall of the Assad regime in Syria, bringing to an end 14 years of revolution and civil war, which had morphed into a proxy war. And while the new authorities led by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, known as HTS, get organized in Damascus, the regional players are reorganizing, in some cases repositioning themselves. Much can be discerned about the shifting geopolitical dynamics from the media messaging coming out of the countries involved. In Iran, there is an attempted rapprochement underway. Having backed the Assad regime for so long, the Iranians are now trying to mend fences with their former adversaries, HTS, and forge a new relationship. In Turkey, where the Erdogan government consistently opposed Assad, there is a whiff of triumphalism in the air and on it. There are also angles and developments where the news coverage has been lacking. Israel's cross-border strikes on Syrian military targets, for instance. They are a big part of this story, even if your news feeds aren't showing it. In the decade and a half since the uprising against the Assad regime kicked off in 2011, the map of Syria has been like a jigsaw puzzle, telling the story of resistance and occupation. Years of stalemate left roughly 70% of the country under the control of the government, backed by Iranian weaponry and Russian air power. Kurdish forces, the SDF, held the east and northeast. Fighters aligned with neighboring Turkey held a chunk of the northwest, next to where the HTS rebels were based, before they and their allies rose up and took control, instantly changing the political lay of the land in Syria.
What's at stake for the region is everything, absolutely everything.
Turkey, Iran, Russia, and Israel is looking to exploit whatever opportunities it can.
And some of them will be supporters of the new government structure, some of them will be spoilers.
Among the casualties of this revolution has been Iran, the relationship it had with Bashar al-Assad's government. For 20 years, Syria has been part of Tehran's sphere of influence, the so-called axis of resistance that included Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, and the Houthis in Yemen. Syria was pivotal to that axis, the only state government to join Iran in an alliance otherwise made up of resistance groups. And Iran invested heavily in Syria, sending in its forces to support Assad's military. But having backed the wrong horse, the leaders of the Islamic Republic now know they need to make amends. And that has been reflected through the media outlets Tehran controls.
You could not have had the Iranian system keep the same discourse as it had in the past, where it was talking about HTS as terrorists. You could not have that in place once HTS took over the country. And the reason for that is, from Iran's perspective, if you do that, you're effectively turning away from HTS. And it was key for Iran to be able to walk away from the Assad regime in the least painful way that they could possibly do that. And one way was to change the way that they spoke about the Assad regime, but also about the rebels and HTS.
منابع رسانه‌ای مخالفان مسلح از به دست گرفتن کنترل 2 شهر رستن و تلبیسه در نزدیکی حمص گزارش دادند.
And that's key because it builds a little bit of goodwill amongst Iran's potential interlocutors in Syria.
That move that we see in the Iranian media acknowledge their miscalculations of supporting Assad, and that's somehow a way forward for Iran maybe to reposition itself in Syria. And their media message, that was a message to Turkey a message also to Russia that this kind of, we acknowledge our miscalculations, we are changing the terminology that we use regarding Syrian armed groups.
There are two factions kind of competing for the media narrative in Iran. The moderates, who have always been less keen on intervening in Syria and have viewed the conflict in Syria as a burden to the Islamic Republic. And then we have the hardliners, the outlets affiliated with the moderates. They shifted very, very quickly. They considered HTS to be a terrorist organization, but they were the first one to change. However, some of the outlets affiliated with the hardliners continue to call them, if not terrorists, extremists.
In Syria, Iran's loss has been Turkey's gain. The government in Ankara quickly dispatched its foreign minister and intelligence chief to Damascus, a reminder to Syria's new leaders that Turkey, a longtime backer of Arab Spring movements, was opposed to the Assad regime. President Recep Tayyip Erdogan has had to contend with the political pressures of having so many Syrian refugees in Turkey, an estimated 3 million of them. He can now tell his people those Syrians have a path home. In a country with an imperial history that still values regional influence, the media narrative on Syria has a celebratory feel to it.
Türkiye mutlu mu? Neden mutlu olmasın ki?
The pro-Erdogan Turkish media displayed clear triumphalism over what happened in Syria. And the reason why Iranian media is so harsh on Turkey is because of Turkey's support to the opposition figures. And for Iran, it's a major setback because traditionally Iran has been accusing the West, US, Israel for the regional challenges Iran faces. But this time, the challenge comes from a pro-Palestinian, even a pro-Hamas Turkish government.
Portraying this as a victory is also a message to his rivals that I'm going to get these refugees out, repatriate them, return them back to Syria safe without having to inhumanely force them out of the country.
Kendi ülkelerinin geleceğine karar verecek olan da Suriye halkıdır.
So of course, naturally, all the media outlets that are affiliated with Erdogan are going to use this terminology, portray this as a victory for Erdogan personally and for his affiliates, not merely for the Syrian people.
It tells me a lot about Erdogan and his strategy, his personality cult. He used the refugee card in order to stabilize his authority internally and to leverage his control. With all of these shifts in regional dynamics, Turkey will emerge from a middle power to more of a hegemony in the region. Erdogan is capturing this moment to emphasize the role of Turkey in the region.
Then there are the troops Turkey has amassed on its border, across from Syrian territory currently controlled by Kurds. Roughly 20% of Turkish citizens are Kurdish, many of whom want their own homeland. Turkish nationalists see the Syrian territory still occupied by Kurds right next door as a threat. Ankara calls it a security issue, but there could be domestic politics at play. The Turkish economy has suffered, taking President Erdogan's polling numbers down with it, and there are all those refugees. Erdogan has held power in Turkey for more than 2 decades and has some authoritarian tendencies. Syria provides him and the news outlets he has brought to heel over the years with a useful distraction.
It won't be surprising if Turkey shows its military muscles in northwest Syria. But that said, the government has been persecuting the opposition figures in Turkey. There are serious concerns about democracy and human rights. Yet, Turkey's media is captivated by Turkey's growing influence in Syria. Erdogan knows it doesn't matter if the Turks struggle economically or not, but they derive immense pride from Turkey's presence in global politics. And the polls, the surveys in Turkey show that.
The other occupied part of Syria is its southwest corner, the Golan Heights, which has been under Israeli control for 57 years. After the fall of Assad, government buildings in Damascus were raided. Documents were reportedly found, then leaked online. They exposed a collaborative operation between Israel and the former regime designed to limit Iranian influence in Syria, revealing that Israel preferred to have a weakened Assad in power rather than take a chance on who would take his place. When Assad fled the country, that arrangement came to an end. The Israeli military then intensified its bombardment of Syrian army bases and weapons depots to cripple the country and its new rulers militarily. It's yet another newsworthy story in Syria, one that has not attracted anything close to the media coverage it deserves.
This is an opportunity to have a dominance over southern Syria. Ironically enough, we don't see this behavior from Israel when Assad was in presence, where never Assad was targeted or his forces, but what was targeted is only Iranian militias. This is ongoing for the last 2 weeks, and that has not attracted enough media coverage.
It's hard to tell if they will commit at this point to retrieving after everything settles in Syria. And also, they know very well that the United States will do very little to stop them, and there will be less of an international outrage over this issue, unlike Gaza, where there continues to be an international outrage. Very few people will talk about this. We're still in the euphoria of getting rid of the regime. And these are all points that Israel is taking to its advantage.
As we approach the end of 2024, there has been no let-up in Israel's relentless attacks on journalists in Gaza, which rights groups say is the most dangerous place in the world to report from. Ryan Kohls is here with more.
Being a journalist in Gaza isn't just a job. For many, it has become a death sentence. This past week, 4 more media workers were killed by Israeli airstrikes, adding to the unprecedented number of Palestinian reporters killed. According to the Gaza Government Media Office, Israeli forces have killed 196 Palestinian media workers in Gaza since October 7, 2023. Among the latest victims is Ahmed Aldoughli, who worked as a cameraman for Al Jazeera alongside other media outlets. On December 15th, he was killed in the Nusayrat refugee camp, wearing a vest clearly marked press. Al Jazeera says the attack was deliberate. Israel hasn't denied that. Instead, its military spokesperson reverted to the usual playbook, calling Aldoughli a terrorist and accusing him of having ties to Islamic Jihad. Aldoughli's killing follows those of Mohammed Balusha, Mohammed Jawar el-Qarnawi, and Iman Shanti, a journalist whose last words on social media were chilling. She posted, "Is it possible we're still alive until now?" Hours later, an Israeli airstrike killed her, her husband, and their children. Meanwhile, inside Israel, the newspaper Haaretz published testimonies this week that exposed the deeply disturbing conduct of Israeli soldiers in Gaza. That includes the systematic execution of unarmed civilians, children among them, as well as a culture of scorekeeping, with commanders encouraging soldiers to kill as many Palestinians as possible, after telling their units that there are no innocents in Gaza. It's that kind of culture of cruelty and impunity within the ranks of the Israeli military that has produced such a horrifying death toll, including of journalists, and shows that attacks on the press aren't accidents. They're part of a broader effort to suppress the story, control the narrative, no matter the cost.
Thanks, Ryan. Over the past 5 years, SpaceX, a company owned by Elon Musk, has been launching satellites into low Earth orbit, creating an internet service called Starlink. What is revolutionary about Starlink is its ability to deliver high-speed internet to just about anywhere on Earth, from the Amazon to the Sahara to Siberia and everywhere in between. It can also come in handy when ground-based internet services that rely on telecom towers or fiber optic cables get knocked out by natural disasters or acts of war. To date, SpaceX has launched around 7,000 satellites, making Starlink the clear leader in this field. And the plan is to keep launching, a total of more than 40,000. However, like many of Elon Musk's business endeavors, this one comes with some red flags. The Listening Post's Nick Muirhead now on Starlink, a monopoly that can be weaponized and the potential consequences of that.
On a clear night, look up and you might spot what appears to be a train of stars traveling across the sky. But they're not stars, satellites, part of Elon Musk's SpaceX constellation, beaming an internet service back to Earth called Starlink.
Ignition, liftoff.
In May 2019, SpaceX launched its first batch of 60 satellites into low Earth orbit. Fast forward 5 years, and there are now more than 7,000 Starlink satellites overhead. Musk wants to launch 42,000, but so far the US regulator, the Federal Communications Commission, or FCC, has only licensed 12,000. But be that as it may, SpaceX currently has 2/3 of all the satellites in low Earth orbit.
Starlink is providing services to about 4 million people across 100 countries globally. The unique thing about Starlink is that this is, satellite internet that is as fast as, or even faster than fiber optic cables and all of that. In the past, traditional satellite internets, they were always slow, but this problem has been solved by Starlink.
Starlink also offers connectivity almost anywhere on Earth. All you need is a terminal, which can be powered by electricity, a generator, even a battery. So no need for ground infrastructure, no telecom towers, no fiber optic cables. The service just needs to be activated in your area and you can get online, which in times of crisis can make Starlink a lifeline.
Natural disasters, especially either an earthquake or a tsunami that may have affected cell phone towers, Starlink can still connect people to the internet. Most recently, it was used in North Carolina for disaster relief in the aftermath of Hurricane Helen, and it was used for Hurricane Ian in 2022.
In the same year, there was a crackdown by the Iranian government on the internet access of its citizens. And SpaceX decided to activate Starlink over Iran, or at least to announce that it is active there to support freedom of speech in the country.
For a lot of people in rural areas and remote areas, Starlink have been able to provide a very good connectivity. We've had cases in Brazil, cases in Rwanda, where Starlink was able to provide connectivity for schools in remote and rural areas.
Then there are times of war. Just before Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022, it launched a series of cyber attacks on the country's internet, crippling the Ukraine military's communication capabilities. With Russian troops closing in and Ukraine's defenses in disarray, the country's digital minister turned to Twitter, pleading with Musk for help. Within hours, he responded, saying that Starlink had been activated in Ukraine and terminals were on the way. The intervention restored vital communications, with an internet service resistant to Russian interference, helping Ukraine's military launch a counteroffensive.
It was the main way of communicating on the battlefield. They would use it to connect their drones and coordinate drone attacks against Russian troops, and they would use it just to communicate with each other, like commanders and officers. And it also helped them communicate with the outside world, which was very crucial for Ukraine.
There's a video by the New York Times where you can see a helicopter landing in Mariupol, a Ukrainian helicopter. And it lands in the Azovstal steel plant that is surrounded by Russian troops. And what this helicopter does is it takes out wounded soldiers, but not before bringing in a Starlink terminal. So you can already see they grew dependent on it.
But depending on a privately owned company with an unpredictable owner in the middle of a war can leave you compromised. By October, Ukrainian forces reported Starlink outages over the front lines, possibly due to SpaceX blocking its own signal, a practice called geofencing. Musk would not disclose the reason for the outages, saying that the information was classified. When Ukraine requested Starlink access in Crimea to target Russian warships, SpaceX refused. Musk said that it would make the Starlink team complicit in a major act of war. However, at the time, he was alleged to be in talks with Vladimir Putin, making it unclear if he reached that decision alone. Musk has denied these allegations, but despite that, the war in Ukraine was a trial by fire for SpaceX, and the world was watching.
The conflict in Ukraine was a showcase of Starlink's abilities for two audiences. The first audience was investors. Bloomberg reported that in 2023 there were tender offers to SpaceX that raised its value so that now it's the second most valuable private company in the world. And the second audience then are political leaders and military leaders, because in times of geopolitical tensions, what you really need is a system that reduces your vulnerabilities to the outside, particularly in communications. SpaceX received a lot of government contracts also following the war in Ukraine, particularly from US departments that are related to defense.
Earlier this year, Reuters revealed that a US intelligence agency was paying SpaceX $1.8 billion to build a global spy network called Starshield. Described as the most advanced surveillance system ever, Starshield will give the US government the power to track targets almost anywhere on Earth in close to real time. Now, global powers from Russia to China and the EU are scrambling to launch their own satellite constellations. The space race has a new frontier, low Earth orbit. Only this time, it is not being led by a government or its space agency. Instead, it's an unelected billionaire. All that stands between Elon Musk and a near monopoly of this critically important technology are US regulations. But with Donald Trump returning to the White House,
and his rocket company is the only reason we can now send American astronauts into space.
The question is, for how long?
Take over, Elon, just take over.
We requested an interview with SpaceX. The company did not respond.
FCC hasn't granted SpaceX the license to launch 42,000 satellites yet, but Musk has constantly been critical of the FCC, claiming that they are too slow. He essentially wants to eliminate this regulation that he feels is holding back SpaceX and his ambitions in low Earth orbit. So I think once Trump is in government with Elon Musk by his side, that definitely does threaten the FCC, because they will want to launch things to space and they'll want to launch things fast.
What is happening with Starlink is actually representative of a broader global trend. And this trend is that an increasing amount of our communication infrastructure on which we rely on every day as individuals, as communities, as states, is in the hands of a few private companies. I think we should take what happened in Ukraine and the involvement of SpaceX and Starlink very seriously. We could clearly see that the decisions being made by SpaceX and Elon Musk substantially influenced the course of the conflict in Ukraine at several points.
Has your ego and ignorance, sir, cost Ukrainian lives? A senior war official says it has.
If Starlink's involvement in Ukraine should prompt us to do one thing, it should be to discuss the actual societal and political implications of this being the case.
And finally, it seemed too perfect, a made-for-TV moment. CNN's chief international correspondent, Clarissa Ward, helping to rescue the last prisoner in an empty Syrian jail days after other inmates had already been liberated. The clip went viral, but as so many internet sleuths detected, the story just did not add up. Online voices pointed out how tidy the prisoner's clothes were, how his fingernails seemed to be perfectly manicured.
You're okay. You're okay. You're okay.
He clutches my arm tightly with both hands.
An investigation by Syrian media fact-checker Verify Sai then revealed the supposed captive was actually a Syrian Air Force intelligence officer, accused by many people in his native city, Homs, of extorting, torturing, and killing opponents of the former regime. Once exposed, Clarissa Ward simply posted an update of the story on X, offering no explanation beyond that and no apology. So was this a case of mistaken identity or something more deliberate? Was the CNN crew duped into broadcasting a staged story? Either way, this episode reinforces what Syrians and others living in war zones have so often said, that many foreign journalists are not there just to report on the story. They can be out to exploit the kind of suffering that creates sensational headlines, sometimes leaving the truth as collateral damage.